Hook, the rain came like a verdict, relentless, loud enough to make the streetlights blur and the city breathe in cold, wet gasps. He spotted her under the awning outside the bakery, a small figure, shoulders hunched against a thin coat that had once been something else's blanket, hands folded over knees that had lost the habit of staying warm. For a second he thought she was asleep, then she whispered, barely louder than the rain, "I have nowhere to sleep." He could have walked on. He didn't. He gave her his bed and slept on the couch. What he didn't know then, and what you'll come to learn by the end of this story, was how that simple choice would crack open both their lives like a door that had been nailed shut for years, how the kindness that looked so small at first would force both of them to face old grief, new hope, and the truth about the kind of courage that asks nothing back. When Samir found her, the bakery's display cases were dark, and the night crowd had thinned to a scatter of umbrellas. He'd been out later than usual, running after a useless call from an old friend. The city had a way of swallowing plans and spitting out exhaustion. He was 32, living alone in a two-room flat above his uncle's tailoring shop. He had a predictable life, a steady job in a small accounting firm, the same commute, the same mug, the same 2 contacts in his phone he actually called. Beneath that ordinary skin, though, there was a rawness he kept bandaged, the recent death of his mother, the soft, immeasurable loss that left the apartment fuller with silence and the bed colder every night. Zara, the name he would learn later, was the kind of person you might miss if you weren't looking closely, thin, with hair that had once been carefully cut and was now uneven, eyes the color of late tea. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned to save motion for important things. When Samir sat on the low ledge beside her and offered the spare sandwich he'd been saving in his bag, she startled as if from a memory, then took it with a hand that trembled. Her voice when she said, "Thank you," was musical and small at once, like a bird that didn't know whether to trust the sky. "What brings you out tonight?" Samir asked, because people ask such questions when they want permission to cross into another's life without meaning to. She laughed, a short sound that might have been something else in another town. "The city. I thought it would be quieter here. Less idea of being seen." She didn't say, alone. She didn't need to. He learned the basics as they sat there, 2 strangers under the bakery's tired awning. She'd run from a house that had been less home than a cage. Her family had been full of good people who had worn kindness like a heavy coat and muffled the things underneath. A job had come and gone, loader, cleaner, short-term temp work, all good for a few weeks then gone. The city's shelters were full or selective. She was too proud for some, too unwell for others. That night, wet and shivering, she'd thought she'd sleep on the bench in the park until a fog of fear pushed her down to the bakery's cold stone and the shelter of an awning. There was a moment between them, the kind that weighs more than any spoken sentence. Samir could see not just the immediate need, the wet coat, the hollow in her cheeks, but the way she held herself like a promise not to ask. And in that moment his grief, the empty pillow at home that had started to smell like absence, folded in on itself and became a decision. "You can come up," he said without thinking about the consequences. "I have a couch. It's not much, but it's dry." She looked at him like someone trying to remember whether they'd known his name before. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he smiled, "the kind that tells strangers you're not a threat." "Neither do you." She hesitated. You could see the negotiations in her face, dignity versus cold. Pride versus the ache of muscles that had been awake for too long. Finally, she nodded. "All right. I'll come up." Upstairs, his flat smelled like his mother's tea and the faint soap of old linens. The couch was small and sprained, the bed was near the window, where light had once kissed his mother's face awake. Zara moved carefully through the small space, a guest in a life she did not own. He put a blanket over her shoulders like a benediction and turned the kettle on for tea. They sat in the quiet, 2 people who had chosen to be honest about the small things, favorite foods, the fact he liked the radio at night, the way she never cooked because she never had the time. That night he slept on the couch. It wasn't noble, it was the practical consequence of having given his bed away. But it also felt like the most natural thing he'd done in months. He woke to the smell of toast and found Zara making eggs with the care of someone who knew nothing but also knew how to be careful. She moved around his kitchen as if it were a rare garden, same hands, new tasks, making something ordinary look like an offering. The first week after that proved to be both soft and harsh. Zara stayed. She took to small jobs, washing dishes at a nearby cafe, folding bakery boxes for a friend of the owner, anything that paid enough for a couple of meals and bus fare. Samir came home to find her asleep on the couch, curled like a comma, and he'd watch her as if learning a new language. Sometimes she cried quietly in the small hours, and he learned that tears sound different when they can fall without being weighed down by shame. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Ahmed from next door, the kind of woman whose life had been measured in recipes and neighborhood gossip, knocked one evening with a plate of samosas and a question, "Who is she?" Her voice was not unkind, but it was curious, and people's curiosity can cut like wind in winter. She needed a place, Samir said, and that was the truth. He tried to keep the story simple, because stories that are too long invite scrutiny. Rumors rippled. Some offered help in half-formed ways, a lead on a job that never quite existed, an uncle's friend who might be able to arrange something in exchange for things that Zara would never offer. Others asked direct, practical questions: was she safe? Was he doing the right thing? There were eyes that measured the risk of inviting strangers in, and eyes that measured how brave he was for doing something so small and dangerous at once. The danger wasn't immediate. The harder tests were quieter. Zara carried a history like a compass set to sorrow, and it pointed toward places she could not easily go. She would flinch when a hand was too close, when a night sound reminded her of slamming doors. She found it difficult to hold still for things that required trust. A doctor's appointment, a meeting with a potential employer, even a casual walk past a group of men who had smelled of old power and expectation. Samir watched her navigate these small storms and felt the tug of helplessness. He was good at numbers, at balancing sheets, at making percentages look neat, but people were not columns to be reconciled. One evening, she didn't come home. He waited, the radio playing low in the background, and his worry multiplied into a dozen questions. Had she left because she felt a burden? Had someone convinced her to take a writing job in another city? He called friends, the cafe where she worked, anyone who might have seen her. Nothing. The police wouldn't take a missing person report because she was legally an adult who had left voluntarily. The system, as he had seen before, was a machine built of forms and polite refusals. When she returned at dawn, she was chased by the rain and by something sharper, a bruise purple along her jaw. She said she'd been propositioned and would not comply. She'd walked until her feet burned, then sat on a bench until the sun made her believe in warmth again. She didn't want to tell him the rest. But the bruise told a story of a city that was still dangerous for those who had to ask for kindness to survive. That night, Samir learned how small the world could be. A man of courtesy and a woman with nowhere comfortable enough to sleep had collided in a way that made safety uncertain. He wanted, with the bluntness of someone who had avoided feeling for too long, to fix everything. But he learned, too, that you can't fix a life by holding a mop. You can only hold a hand and clean a small part of the floor while the rest waits. Zara, for her part, began to open in small, hurled ways. She confessed that she had a name for the thing that kept her from staying in one place: shame. She said it like a foreign word, practiced. Shame is a heavy coat, she said once. You put it on to keep people from seeing what's underneath. But it also makes your shoulders stiff. Samir listened, which in itself became part of the healing. He learned how to be present when she needed to speak and silent when she needed a quiet room to take inventory of her scars. Together they navigated paperwork for shelters, met with a counselor referred by the cafe owner, and made a plan that was both modest and startling in its hope: a small savings goal, a vocational course, applying for social housing. Each step felt like moving through a swamp, each small success was a handhold found. The major test came when his uncle, a man of pragmatism and old rules, discovered Zara's presence. The tailoring shop below had been in the family for decades, and the landlord, a man who believed in taxes and territories, was stern about guests who stayed more than a few nights. "You can't just bring someone into your home and expect everyone to be fine," his uncle said, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who had learned that systems and obligations sometimes outrank spontaneous virtues. Samir argued with him and lost. The landlord issued a warning: transient guests beyond a certain number could risk eviction. The choice was suddenly no longer philosophical but literal. Samir could keep Zara with him and risk losing the flat, the only real tether he had to the life his mother had left, or he could ask her to leave into the city that had already given her so little. Zara, when he told her, did not panic. She packed small, precise things: a sweater, the notebook where she kept small poems, and the grocery list for a life she had once imagined. She looked at him with the mild ferocity of someone who had accepted that life asked more of her than comfort. "You can't throw me away," she said, and he realized she thought he had been keeping her from harm by staying. He shook his head. "No, words trembled. "You can stay." They went to the landlord together. Zara, with a calm that surprised everyone, explained herself. She spoke plainly about needing a place to sleep, about wanting to work, about the ways she would not be a burden. She didn't plead, she presented reality and offered a solution. She would pay, starting small, for utilities, she would keep the place tidy, she would be invisible in the ways the landlord demanded. The landlord, who had seen enough of the city to know when a life could be corrected or ruined by an act of small mercy, relented in the end. Maybe it was the steadiness in her voice. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, the one he had lost to distance and a life too quickly lived. He allowed it. That night they celebrated with toast that counted as too much, and both felt like thieves of a small joy. They had survived the first test. But tests, like storms, often announced themselves again. The second chapter of their lives together wasn't so much a change of scene as a peeling back of layers. With the immediate need addressed, with a legal roof and a plan that fit into folders in a small drawer, the deeper work began, the slow, stubborn labor of mending trust and learning to live with scars that never quite went away. Zara enrolled in a vocational course to become a seamstress, ironically threading herself into the very world of fabric and hems that had once been the domain of Samir's uncle. She was quick with an eye for detail, she had fingers that had learned to count the world in the movement of hands. Samir found a way to connect his world of numbers to hers. He helped her with applications, with the tiny bureaucracy of certificates and forms. It was, in many ways, the most romantic work either of them had known, the mutual scaffolding necessary to build a life that could stand. As months passed, things that had felt impossible began to feel like routine. Zara saved small, triumphant amounts of money. Samir began to expect her laughter to tumble into the flat at odd hours like sunlight. They built a ritual of Saturday morning walks to the market where she chose vegetables with a considered hand, or Monday nights when they sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork and turned what looked like obstacles into list items. The presence of another person softened the jaggedness of grief. He found himself telling stories about his mother in ways that didn't make him collapse. She would listen, occasionally correcting a detail he had always gotten wrong. But healing is not a straight line. The past had a way of returning like tides. One afternoon a man from Zara's past, a man who had been kind at first, then less so, knocked on the bakery where she worked. He had news. He'd heard she was working, that she was doing well, and he offered friendship that smelled suspiciously like old patterns. Zara stiffened. She told her supervisor she needed the day off and went home to breathe, to count whatever air she could call safe. That evening the man appeared at the flat. He left a note slipped beneath the door that said, "We should talk." Samir felt the old muscle of anger rise up, a clumsy, protective instinct. When Zara sat down with the note in her hands, her face was calm but cold. "He thinks he can fix things with conversation," she said. "He thinks we owe him explanations for not being what he wanted." She told him she would handle it, that she would not be pulled into old arguments. She would call the police if she felt threatened. She would, and in saying these things she was marking a boundary she had never been able to mark before. The test came not from outside, but from within. One night, after a celebration for the small business success of the bakery owner, the kind of evening that made everyone sing in a private key, Zara snapped. She cried in a way Samir had never heard, not the private tears, but the inconsolable, convulsive kind that sounds like a life breaking open. She had been offered a day job across town. It paid more but required a longer commute and nights away. It promised the financial independence she desired but threatened the fragile routine they had built. You should take it, Samir said, because he believed in growth like a duty. It's what you wanted. And lose this? She asked through a sob. Lose you in the evenings? Lose this little world I have learned to live in? Her words were jagged. I don't know how to do both. He realized then how intertwined safety and love can become, how dependency can masquerade as affection and how affection can be a safe harbor but also a net that keeps you from learning to swim. They argued and then sat in silence, two people learning the grammar of a relationship that involved choice rather than ownership. They learned boundaries then. Zara took the job. She worked long hours. Samir learned to be proud without being possessive. They found ways to bridge the time apart, notes left on the kitchen counter, small lunches packed for the weekends, texts that read like map coordinates. I made tea, doors unlocked, saw a pigeon with a rainbow band. The little things became proof that distance didn't erase connection. The community that had once been skeptical slowly extended a gentler hand. Mrs. Ahmed became Zara's unexpected ally, bringing over dishes and a kind of ear that listened like prayer. The bakery owner helped Zara negotiate a better schedule during the finals of her course. Even the landlord softened, arriving one morning with an old radio he thought she might like. Small acts multiplied into an atmosphere of support that was fragile, yes, but real. A year in, they had a small party, nothing grand, just neighbors and 2 or 3 co-workers, to celebrate Zara's certificate and the little savings she had tucked away for a deposit on a room of her own. They sat under a string of lights that made the flat look like a place that had once dreamed of being something more. Conversations drifted to future plans and the ways people hoped to outrun old debts. During the party, Zara slipped out onto the small fire escape and found Samir sitting alone, looking up at the sky like someone who talked to stars as if they were old friends. You okay? She asked. No, he smiled. I'm happy. Afraid. Proud. Terrified I'll lose this. He gestured at them, at the fragile life, at the guests who laughed into their drinks. We won't lose it, she said softly, and for the first time he saw a possibility of a future where both of them could hold separate things and still meet in the middle. We're different people who decided to be kind to each other. That doesn't mean we will always be the same. It means we will keep choosing, even when it's hard. The challenge that nearly tore them apart arrived in the form of an emergency at the tailoring shop. Samir's uncle suffered a stroke. The shop, which was the family's anchor, required someone reliable to run it for a while. Samir took a leave from his job to help, balancing invoices and orders in a new way, the familiar arithmetic of thread and fabric. Becoming unexpectedly literal. This placed strain on their routines, his online work slackened, Zara's schedule remained fragile, and the tiny home they shared felt more crowded with worry than with laughter. In the quiet, between hospital visits and mending seams, they had to decide what home meant. For Zara, home had once been a house that asked more than it gave. For Samir, home had been a seat in a life predetermined by responsibility. They decided, slowly, to build a third definition, home as a chosen place, not just an inherited one. They both agreed that when Zara was ready, she should take the deposit and move into a small room nearby. She would keep working at the bakery, and they would remain close. When she finally moved, it was a ceremony of small things, the passing of a key, the placement of a plant near a window that looked onto the street, the leaving of a mug that was his favorite on her shelf. They cried, laughed, and then began to practice the skill of loving someone who was also separate. In the months that followed, their relationship took on a deep, easy rhythm: visits, long messages, shared meals on the weekends. They celebrated each other's wins without fear, and when losses came, they were less lonely for having another person who would know their grief. The most important test, though, came when Zara received a letter. She was being considered for a small business grant targeted at micro-entrepreneurs with a vocational background. It was a long shot and required a demonstration of both skill and stability. She worked nights cutting and stitching, developing a line of simple, durable bags. She believed in the work because it felt honest and because it connected her to something she had always loved, the idea that you could take scraps of life and make them useful. Samir, who had always been cautious with money, found himself using savings to help her buy materials. He felt the old ache of scarcity when he signed a check, yet the sense of being part of something larger quieted that fear. She applied, spoke at an interview with the kind of soft confidence that came from nights of practice, and won the grant. It was not a fortune, but it was a doorway, a chance to turn a patchwork skill into a small enterprise. They celebrated, not with grandeur, but with intention. Mrs. Ahmed bought the first bag as a gift. The landlord hung an embroidered sign in his shop window advertising Zara's work. The bakery owner included a small card with each order, and the town began to notice a seamstress who made things to be used, not merely admired. Years later, when people asked them how they had met, they would tell a shortened, sweeter version: a rainy night, a couch, a bed given up. But the fuller truth, the one that carried the weight of real life, was more complicated. It involved broken doors, a landlord who could be swayed, nights of crying that turned into mornings of work, the slow stitches that mended not only fabric but the possibility of trust. In the end, they both learned that kindness was not an act of heroism but a practice. Samir learned that giving away your bed did not mean losing everything, it meant waking up to a life that required presence. Zara learned that asking for help did not erase dignity, it reframed it. Together they discovered that home is less a place and more a series of small agreements: to show up, to speak truth, to allow someone to be more than the worst thing that had happened to them. On a winter morning, years from that first rainy night, they stood on the same bakery awning where they had first met. The city had changed, new faces, new storefronts, but the smell of bread and the hush of dawn felt familiar. They had taken different paths and kept choosing to walk back toward each other. Zara's little business had folded in a way that fit into the neighborhood, and Samir had found peace in the balance between his work and the things that mattered. He looked at her and saw the same tea-colored eyes that had first asked for shelter. She looked back and saw a man who had learned to make room. They held hands, not because they needed to make a point to anyone watching but because it reminded them how far a single act of kindness could travel. Around them, a few people went about their mornings, unaware of the quiet miracle that had unfolded above the bakery for years. It began with a bed, Samir said, half laughing, half sincere. It began with a whisper, Zara replied. They smiled, and in that small exchange lay the thing the city rarely teaches: that redemption is not a lightning strike but a string of ordinary choices, and that the bravest acts are often the ones that ask for nothing in return. If you leave this story thinking of one thing, let it be this. The world isn't healed by grand gestures alone, it is mended by the tiny openings where one person makes space for another, by the night someone chooses to sleep on a couch so another can rest. Those openings, when tended with consistency and courage, grow into doors, and doors lead to rooms where people can learn to live again. And so, on a morning that was both ordinary and holy, they walked back inside, carrying 2 loaves of bread and the quiet knowledge that sometimes, a single whispered plea, "I have nowhere to sleep," can set 2 lives on the path to becoming whole.